I've come across an absolutely fabulous reference book for the soloist, and I'd like to present it to you here, give you a look inside it, and explain why I think it's so useful. This is The Monsters Know What They're Doing, Combat Tactics for Dungeon Masters. It is based on his blog of the same name, The Monsters Know What They're Doing, and it is published, I'll give you the copyright credits here, by Saga Press. That's an imprint of Simon & Schuster, 2019. You can see the copyright credit for the text, the cover art, and the interior art. What is done here is the author goes through the monster manual for 5th edition, and as the flap copy says, it helps you understand what the stat blocks mean, what the monster's ability means in terms of actually how an encounter would work, the ways in which a monster may or may not approach or attack in any given situation, and analyzes this for 5th edition. I believe the book is extremely useful whether you're playing 5th edition or not, because as I'll show you as we go through it a little bit, what's really fleshed out here beyond the stats are the narrative implications of those stats, are the ways in which a monster's, say, psychology, if you want to use that word, would influence what the actual monster did in terms of when they attacked, how they attacked, even if they attacked, whether they could be reasoned with or not. And that's what's discussed here, in addition to the stats and the mechanics of 5th edition. So if you're using 5th edition, absolutely, there are very specific examples here. To some extent, there are even keyed examples to certain pages in the manual, and I think possibly also in the DM's guide as reference points. If you're not using 5th edition, though, if you're just running something else, it is still exceedingly useful, as we'll see when we start to look in the material itself. As does 5th edition, the monsters here are divided up into various groupings: humanoids, NPCs, monstrosities, dragons, giants, the undead, aberrations, fiends, celestials, fae, elementals, constructs, oozes and plants, and beasts. The beginning of each section, there is a very brief overview of the common traits of that section, and that also provides a little bit of larger meta understanding about what to look for in terms of the traits of the monsters in that grouping that might come in, and how that would impact how they would respond to a given situation. The relationship of the book to the blog, the author says it's consolidated, revised, in some cases corrected, and supplemented with additional material, including analyses of monsters not examined on the blog. He says, note, this is not a substitute for the monster manual or any other D&D book. For the actual abilities, traits, and other stats, there aren't really stat blocks in here. You'll need to refer to the monster manual. So I wanted to make that note. The book begins with a discussion of the assumptions that the author is making, and I'm just going to call out something that I found useful to think about in general as you are creating situations and encounters for yourself. He says 2 key elements in a creature's ability contour are its primary defensive ability and primary offensive ability. His ability contour is the pattern of high and low scores in a creature's stat block, and how that defines the creature's overall approach to combat. He goes on to say that with Constitution or Dexterity as the primary defensive ability is going to determine whether a creature relies on its toughness to absorb incoming damage or on its nimbleness and mobility to avoid it. The primary offensive ability may be strength, dexterity, or a mental ability, and it determines whether a creature prefers to do damage via brute force melee, finesse, or ranged attacks. And then he goes on to categorize different types of creatures vis-a-vis stat blocks, and I think this is useful to as a takeaway for anything that you're doing, even if it has nothing to do with D&D. For example, small, low-strength creatures try to compensate with numbers, and when their numbers are reduced enough, they scatter. That in and of itself is something to remember if you are in a setting just totally not even in this D&D fantasy world, and a small low strength creature comes in, it can guide you in what would be an appropriate number of creatures to come, and also an appropriate response, an appropriate amount of how the combat is going to go. Is there going to be a point at which those creatures will scatter and leave the combat, even if the specific rules don't call for that? I'm not going to go through all of this, but he continues on. Low dexterity creatures must choose their battles judiciously because they're not likely to be able to get out of a fight once they're in it. And then he goes on, high strength, high constitution, high strength, high dexterity. Again, this overall framework is something as a reference point that can be extremely useful to creating realistic, and I say that with quotes because of course we're talking fantasy here, but realistic encounters. He also mentioned something of note that I wanted to call out. A creature with a feature that requires a saving throw to avoid will often favor this feature over a simple attack, even if the average damage may be slightly less. Why? This is because the presumption of an attack action is failure, and the burden is on the attacker to prove success. The presumption of a feature that requires a saving throw is success, and the burden is on the defender to prove failure. Moreover, attacks that miss do no damage at all, ever. Features that require saving throws often have damage effects even if the targets succeed on their saves. Well, why do I mention this? Again, we often find ourselves in situations where there is a choice to be made about what attack may be used and why. And in those situations, many times we are just relegated to, say, tossing a dice. Well, 50-50 or 60-40. But here is some kind of reason behind choosing one over the other that is not simply just a die roll. That, I think, can be an effective way, or a more effective way, of simulating something that would actually take place and make sense. Finally, the point that's been made here that I want to call out, it's been made elsewhere, it's been made by me, but it bears repeating. Sometimes a monster is less of an enemy and more of an obstacle. Offer your PCs 2 or 3 ways around it, and they can discover if they're creative. A monster encounter doesn't always have to be a combat encounter. This is, of course, nothing new to say. It's something that has been pointed out by many people, including myself in other videos, but again, a point really bearing in mind, especially when doing solo work, that to further your story, to create narrative interest in your story, you don't necessarily always want to be assuming that the presence of an enemy is going to lead directly to combat. Next, he goes into a little bit more lengthy discussion of the 14 different types of monsters that 5th edition organizes them into, the types of the categories that they're in. And I wanted to just point out something because I feel that I'm guilty of overlooking this with the undead. Undead creatures are driven by compulsions generated by whatever spell, influence, or event caused them to rise from the dead. The simplest undead creatures are compelled by the orders of whoever or whatever controls them or once controlled them. Ghosts are compelled by the need to resolve unfinished business. Other mid and high-level undead are compelled by hunger, malice, megalomania. Whatever the compulsion of an undead creature, everything it does revolves around that and serves it in some way. It supersedes everything else, sometimes including the creature's continued existence. I seem to have done a bunch of videos with skeletons in them, for example. I don't know why, it just turned out that way. And I can see in looking back at some of those that I would have had much more of a narrative hook to give had I focused on the fact that the compulsion of an undead has to do with what that creature was like in life, because that opens up, as you can imagine, an entire range of things to do. Tables that you can find and roll on to basically create the backstory for the undead creature, and then based on that backstory, influence how it's going to be behaving in the particular encounter. So it's not just a skeleton coming in with no history, that the very fact that there is a skeleton lets you know that there's a history there. And so that's one example of how thinking about the typology of the creature, which this book encourages you to do, can be so useful in adding narrative richness. Here's another one, aberrations. Aberrations, by definition, are beings whose ultimate goals make no sense to us, and for this reason, coming up with decent, plausible schemes for them can be challenging. Fall back on conventional schemes of domination, and you risk making your aberrations into a funny-looking humanoid for all intents and purposes. An aberration's behavior has to be weird, but also for an aberration to be a villain rather than a mere curiosity, it has to pose some kind of threat. A good solution is to have them brainwashing ordinary people into participating in their weird schemes, etc. This also leads explicitly to the fact that if you're dealing with an aberration in your encounter, you can feel fairly confident that rolling randomly on some tables to give it things to do, things to focus on, obsessions, whatever, is actually narratively thematic in the larger sense. Now I want to move on and look a little bit more specifically at a couple of the entries to show you how they can be of use. In the humanoid category, we're going to turn to orcs. Unlike goblins and kobolds, orcs are strong and tough. They're not very smart. Their behavior is largely driven by instinct, but they possess average wisdom and decent dexterity. They have the aggressive trait, which allows them to move their full speed toward a hostile creature as a bonus action, effectively allowing them to dash forward. Curiously, they have proficiency in a social skill, and that is intimidation. Their standard melee weapon, the Great Axe, deals damage that can be deadly to a level 1 character. These are no hit-and-run skirmishers or snipers. Orcs are brutes. They charge, they fight hand-to-hand, they retreat only with the greatest reluctance or when seriously wounded. The aggressive trait applies chiefly to one situation, when a group of orcs is between 30 and 60 feet away from the player characters. As a DM, you should therefore assume that first contact with a group of orcs always takes place at this distance, that the orcs will be initially hostile, and that they'll charge the second they decide talking is boring. However, the fact that orcs have any social skill at all, even if it's just intimidation, suggests that there ought to be some opportunity to interact before combat begins. Now, again, for the soloist, you can see where if you are dealing with a situation and, say, rolling on a table and you find an orc, the fact that the orc is going to be most aggressive to you at this particular distance gives you a narrative hook, a narrative toehold, I guess I could say, to start to ask the question, well, are we this far away? Maybe you know you're not because of the setting that you know you're already in, but you could also decide, well, let me roll on a table. So here's an example of a distance table. There are many. This is from Scarlet Heroes, to see how far away I actually am. And you would translate these into being within this distance of 30 to 60. If you were not, say you were further away, you might not need to have that encounter. Were you closer, you could try to do something else. And the book here continues on to say, a smooth talker may be able to stave off an attack by making a charisma persuasion check with disadvantage against DC 15, say, or maybe DC 20, if the orcs are there for a specific purpose, such as guarding something or staking a territorial claim. Now again, if you're not playing 5th edition, we're going to need to translate what this means into the theme or ideas or concepts or rules of whatever rule set you're working with, but it is still very doable. And it gives you some external idea that there may be something else to do that makes thematic and narrative sense vis-a-vis the orc encounter. If you succeed, the orc's attitude shifts from hostile to indifferent. If it fails, however, give the party only one more chance to successfully reach a détente. So the further information here about orcs can turn your encounter that involves orcs from just something that's like automatic, yet another as this author says, rah, rah, bash, bash encounter into something with a little more contours, with a little more questions that can be naturally asked and answered by you to determine what might happen and how it might be thematically appropriate. The entry does offer something else of note. He writes, the monster manual lists several orc variants that may appear in encounters with intermediate level PCs, and then he goes on to delineate this Orog, which is a stronger, tougher, smarter variant, and talks about that, an orc war chief, and then the orc Eye of Grummash, which is a battlefield cleric. You could, if you wanted, when you encountered an orc, if you were using this book as a reference, decide to yourself either using, say, a D4 for like the regular orc, the Orog, the war chief, and the Eye of Grummash, or some other way, some percentile chart that you make up or percentile idea that you have. What's the likelihood that the orc I encounter is going to be regular? Maybe it's going to be 60%. And then if not, it's going to be one of these three, to add further detail into your encounter based on the material in this book. Let's take a look now at something that is categorized as a monstrosity, which are the mimics. Mimics are really cool, somewhat intimidating, I would say. They have been around a long time, and he refers to them as one of the dirtiest tricks a dungeon master can pull on incautious players. This is something where, say, a quote-unquote door, or more often quote-unquote a treasure chest, turns out to be a carnivorous monster. It evolves into this other thing. How could this be? At some point in prehistory, the mimic's ancestors must have disguised themselves as natural objects, using octopus-like camouflage, only later adopting the forms of man-made objects after exposure to humanoid beings. This suggests a unique, specialized intelligence akin to the ability of parrots and certain other birds to mimic human speech, but one that's used to lure and capture prey. With strong physical ability scores across the board, but especially high strength and constitution, the mimic is a brute adapted to close-range fighting. And it goes on to talk a little bit about what this actually means. What's of use here is, well, it's all of use, I think, to flesh this out, because this would be an example of an enemy that I would not feel confident introducing, not really feel confident in how to have it fight, how to have it be a narrative contribution. But his analysis of what D&D is presenting is so useful. Let's take a step back for a moment and read the description of the adhesive trait. The mimic adheres to anything that touches it, not any creature, but anything. To me, the author writes, that means that if you strike the mimic with a melee weapon, the weapon sticks to it. And it goes on to give you the rest of the description. He writes, it seems reasonable to me that a player character who wants to free their weapon from the mimic's gluey surface should have to make the same escape check as a PC who's grappled by it. Thus, you can hit the mimic with your own sword on round 1, but you have to spend round 2 trying to pry it loose. So this little detail, I think, could give you, again, what we're looking for as soloists is a narrative toehold into something that if you're having yourself encounter a mimic, that it would be, part of the challenge would be in having none of what you are doing touch it. So you might want to try to do a ranged attack on it or involve magic as opposed to using your sword, even if primarily you are a melee fighter, that you would try to look around for some way in which to engage with it that would not force you into that situation. It just gives a little more three-dimensionality and something to look at. A couple more under the giants here. We will have a look at the stone giants because, again, another example, what I'm trying to do is just give you examples of some of the details analysis and how it can help you add some three-dimensionality to your own work. So talking about stone giants and how they love throwing rocks, he makes the point that they're introverted and less belligerent than other kinds of giants. They'd rather drive trespassers off than tangle with them. So he writes, so a stone giant won't move any closer to its target, even if it's at long range and attacking with disadvantage, because its attack is merely meant as a deterrent. A shot across the bow can be as good as one directly into the hull. And again, this is letting you have some more choices available to you, choices that make thematic sense to the history, the lore, the stat blocks of these monsters in your encounter. So if you were just rolling on a table and you came up with a stone giant, instead of either you trying to run away or have some lopsided encounter that you might have normally gotten into, referencing the stone giant here and realizing what's going on may give you a different narrative direction to go in. I wanted to talk again, as I did slightly earlier, just about this idea of the undead and the focus on the fact that the transformation to undeath doesn't entirely erase what a ghost or zombie was in its previous life, and that these creatures often carry that history with them. He writes, undeath is a curse, and as such, it creates what I think of as compulsions. That is, whatever spell, influence, or event caused a creature to rise from the dead also drives that creature to behave in ways that have nothing to do with its own self-preservation. So in this case, you could encounter skeletons who are motivated by something that you then have to bring into the story. For example, both skeletons and zombies, former humanoids, raised from death through necromancy to act as minions without free will or personality. Their compulsion is obedience to the orders of their controller, which usually involves killing interlopers. Now, it says when idle, a skeleton reverts to habitual behaviors from its former life. Well, again, this will give you, if you haven't already fleshed out the history of your enemy or the motivations, the larger motivations in the world that you're traveling in that are the forces against you, if you encounter a skeleton, this can be the way in to doing that by building up and investigating the past of the skeleton, and the ways in which you would do that is that's well for a different video and certainly been demonstrated in other videos, but how you bring a past history onto an NPC or a character, in this case thinking of the skeletons almost like an NPC when you are thinking that they have a backstory that is relevant. And here he goes on to say how a skeleton fights depends on how it would have fought in a previous life. A former archer, for instance, instinctively knows how to maintain a certain range, etc. These are just a few of the many examples I could have given from this book that give the, well, obviously a GM for a tabletop game, but the soloist so much material that will eliminate some of the almost knee-jerk, well, I have an enemy, now I'm going to have a combat, fight, 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 that can happen. That it will help you understand more the motivations, or I should say, help you apply motivations, behavior, psychology to the enemies that make sense based on the actual descriptions, the actual stats of these monsters in 5th edition. Also portable to any other rule set, because the mainstay ideas of what these monsters are not going to change. The expression of their mechanics and stats will change with different rule sets, but an elemental is an elemental is an elemental, for example. And speaking of elementals, the final thing I want to say is that having this book gives me the confidence to introduce what I would think of as more complex or bigger in some way, not literally bigger, but bigger conceptual enemies to fight. For example, elementals, because there's just a lot to manage and understand about a creature. Well, in this case, that's not really a creature. And here we are walked through ways in which, for example, the elemental might be moving. And if you wanted to enhance your encounter by having an actual grid and moving it around, you could do that using this as just enough information, but not too much information. And I think that's the final message that I would give about the book. It does take from the Monster Manual, and probably many or all of us who play solo have that and draw from it ourselves. But here it is already extracted for you, minus the specific stats, although you saw some of the references there. What's extracted are the themes, the ideas, the narrative, the feeling of that monster. And as I've said, really across my channel on the solo RPG work, what we're aiming for is to use RPG rule sets to create a feeling of adventure, a feeling of an encounter, a feeling of an exploration. And that is the heart of our story. And ultimately, that is the key to what would be considered a quote unquote successful endeavor with a solo session. Not how well you know the rules or how many die rolls you get to make or even how many successes or failures you have, but the ability to create tension, excitement, even surprise when you are doing all the work yourself. And having the right reference books can be key. And this one, The Monsters Know What They're Doing, is going to, I'm sure, be one of my go-to reference books when I'm playing to see what I can draw from it to add into the narrative. And you will see this book again, I'm sure, in individual videos that I do, but I wanted to give you just a look inside the book on its own, separate from that, because I think it's that useful.